Commander Jake Harrison stood at the big window of the human ship Terra Nova and looked out at the huge space station that slowly turned in front of them. The station belonged to the Galactic Council, and it was the most important place in the galaxy. Stars of many colors shone behind it like tiny jewels against the black of space. Jake had seen this view many times before, but it still made him feel small and amazed. Humanity had been part of the galactic community for 50 years now. When Earth first made contact with alien species, everyone had been scared about what might happen. But the galaxy turned out to be a peaceful place. The aliens welcomed humans with open arms and were happy to share their knowledge and technology. There had been no wars, no fights, no violence of any kind for 300 years. Dr. Lisa Carter walked up beside Jake and looked out the window too. She was the ship's expert on alien life and had spent 10 years studying the different species in the galaxy. Lisa loved her work because every alien race was so interesting and different from humans. The Zilani were tall blue beings who used only logic to make decisions. They never got angry or sad or happy. They just thought about problems and solved them with pure reason. The Mokari were small green creatures who could feel the emotions of others. They had big eyes that seemed to see right into your heart. Because they could feel what everyone else felt, they never wanted to hurt anyone. The idea of causing pain made them sick. They spent their time helping others and making beautiful music that could calm any troubled mind. The Thracians were the strangest of all. They looked like jellyfish but could fly through space without ships. Long ago they had been many separate beings, but now they all shared one big mind. They thought as one and created art together. Their light shows in space were so beautiful that people came from all over the galaxy just to watch them. Jake knew that all these species had once been different. He had read the old records that most people ignored. Long ago, before the Great Peace began, the galaxy had been a dangerous place. There had been terrible wars that lasted for centuries. Whole worlds had been destroyed. Billions of beings had died in battles that seemed to have no end. But that was ancient history now. The species had evolved beyond their old violent ways. They had learned that fighting solved nothing and only caused suffering. War was something that belonged in the past, like using stone tools or living in caves. The modern galaxy was civilized and peaceful. Lisa pointed to a beautiful ship that was making patterns of light in space near the station. "Look at that Thracian art ship," she said with wonder in her voice. "They are creating a story about the birth of a new star. Isn't it amazing how they can work together like that?" Jake nodded, but something bothered him. In the old records, he had read about species that were nothing like the ones he knew today. The Skarn had once been masters of biological warfare. They could create diseases that would kill entire populations. The Void Hunters had been pirates who lived in the empty spaces between stars. They attacked without warning and showed no mercy to their victims. But now the Skarn were philosophers who spent their time thinking about the meaning of life. The Void Hunters had become explorers who mapped distant galaxies. Every violent species had somehow become peaceful and gentle. It was like the galaxy had forgotten how to be dangerous. "I've been thinking about something," Jake said to Lisa. "Don't you find it strange that every species just stopped being violent? I mean, completely stopped. Not even small fights or arguments." Lisa looked at him with curiosity. "What do you mean?" "Violence is primitive. We all evolved beyond it. That's what civilization means. But humans still have violent instincts," Jake said. "We control them, but they're still there. We play aggressive sports, we make movies about war, we tell stories about heroes who fight monsters. We didn't lose our capacity for violence. We just learned to channel it into safe activities." Lisa thought about this for a moment. "Maybe that's why we're different. Maybe that's why we adapted so well to space travel and exploration. We still have that survival instinct that pushes us to take risks and face the unknown." Jake wondered if their human nature was really an advantage or just a leftover from their primitive past. Every other species seemed happy and content with their peaceful lives. They had solved the problem of violence by simply removing it from their nature. Humans were the only ones who still carried the old instincts. the Terra Nova docked with the station, and Jake prepared to meet with the council representatives. Today, they would discuss expanding human exploration to the outer rim of the galaxy. It was routine work in a routine galaxy where the biggest problems were trade disputes and resource allocation. None of them knew that in the dark spaces between stars, something ancient was stirring, something that had been waiting for the galaxy to forget the lessons of war, something that would soon remind them why evolution had never truly abandoned the capacity for violence. The peaceful galaxy was about to learn that some things were worth fighting for, and that sometimes the only way to preserve peace was to remember how to wage war. Captain Amy Rodriguez was having a normal day on her patrol ship when the emergency signal came through. She was checking the outer rim sectors where nothing interesting ever happened. The same routine scans, the same empty space, the same peaceful quiet that had lasted for 300 years. Then her communications officer turned to her with a worried look on his face. "Captain, we're getting a distress call from the mining colony on Kepler 7, he said. "But it's strange. The signal keeps cutting out, and what we can hear doesn't make much sense." Amy walked over to the communications station and listened to the broken message. The voice was full of panic and fear. It talked about shadows moving between the stars and darkness that seemed alive. The person speaking sounded terrified in a way that Amy had never heard before. People in the peaceful galaxy didn't get scared like this. There was nothing to be afraid of. "Try to clean up the signal," Amy ordered. "Maybe there's interference from the solar storms in that sector." Dr. Steve Walsh, the ship's chief scientist, worked on the message for an hour. When he finally got it clear enough to understand, everyone on the bridge went quiet. The colonist was screaming about things that couldn't exist. He talked about shadows that moved with purpose and intelligence. He said the darkness was hunting them and that it whispered terrible things in their minds. Amy sent her ship toward the colony at maximum speed. She had never dealt with anything like this before. In her 20 years of service, the worst emergency she had handled was a reactor malfunction. Pirates didn't exist anymore. Wars were ancient history. Whatever was happening on Kepler 7 was something completely new when they arrived at the colony. Amy found something that made no sense. The buildings were still there and the power was still on, but the people were gone. Not dead, just gone. Their life signs showed they were still alive somewhere, but the sensors couldn't locate them. It was like they had just vanished into thin air. The away team that went down to investigate found the colonists in the main shelter. They were all alive, but they couldn't speak or move. They just sat there staring at nothing with eyes full of terror. Dr. Walsh scanned them with every medical device he had, but their bodies were perfectly healthy. Whatever had happened to them had affected their minds, not their bodies. Amy sent a report to the Galactic Council immediately. She had never seen anything like this before, and she didn't know how to help the colonists. The council sent their best medical teams, but they were just as confused as Amy's crew. The colonists were trapped in their own minds, experiencing some kind of endless nightmare. Elder Tethys of the Mokari arrived on the second day. He was one of the most respected beings in the galaxy, known for his wisdom and his powerful empathic abilities. When he tried to connect with the colonists' minds, he pulled back immediately like he had been burned. His usual calm expression was replaced with something Amy had never seen before on an alien face: pure terror. "What did you sense?" Amy asked him. Elder Tethys was quiet for a long time before he answered. "Something that should not exist," he said. "Something from the old stories that we told ourselves were just myths. The Umbral have returned." Amy had never heard that word before. When she looked it up in the galactic database, she found almost nothing. There were just a few references. In the oldest records, fragments of stories that had been mostly deleted. The Umbral were described as beings of living shadow that fed on fear and despair. They were supposed to be legends, scary stories from the time before the Great Peace. "But that's impossible," Amy said. "Those are just old myths. Creatures like that can't be real." Elder Tethys looked at her with his large, sad eyes. "We wanted to believe they were myths," he said. When the galaxy chose peace, we decided to forget the things that had made us afraid. We deleted the records, destroyed the weapons, and convinced ourselves that the old enemies were just stories. But some things don't die just because we stop believing in them. More colonies went dark over the next few days. The pattern was always the same. The settlements would send frantic messages about shadows and darkness, then all communication would stop. When rescue teams arrived, they would find the people alive but trapped in their own minds, experiencing terrors that couldn't be described. The Galactic Council called emergency sessions, but they had no idea what to do. Their peacekeeping forces were trained to handle disputes between civilized beings, not to fight monsters from ancient nightmares. Their weapons were designed to stun or restrain, not to destroy. They had no experience with enemies that couldn't be reasoned with or negotiated with. Amy found herself studying the few remaining war records that hadn't been deleted. What she learned made her blood run cold. The Umbral had attacked the galaxy before thousands of years ago. They had been defeated, but not through diplomacy or advanced technology. They had been beaten by species that understood something the modern galaxy had forgotten, that some enemies could only be stopped by fighting back. The peaceful galaxy was about to learn that their greatest strength had become their greatest weakness. They had forgotten how to be afraid, and more importantly, they had forgotten how to make others afraid. Commander Pete Davis received the emergency call while his ship was docked at the Centauri trade hub. The message was short and desperate. The Umbral had found the massive space station and were attacking it right now. Pete had read the reports about the colony attacks, but this was different. The trade hub had over 50,000 people from dozens of different species. If the Umbral took control of it, they would have access to the main trade routes of the galaxy. Pete's ship reached the station in less than an hour. What he saw through the viewports made his stomach turn. The entire station was covered in a strange darkness that seemed to move and pulse like it was alive. The normal bright lights of the docking bays were dim and flickering. Emergency signals flashed weakly through the shadow like distress calls from a drowning ship. Sergeant Mary Johnson led the first team of human Marines onto the station. She had been trained for combat situations, even though real combat hadn't happened in the galaxy for centuries. The training was considered old-fashioned by most species, but humans still practiced it because they believed in being prepared for anything. When Mary and her team entered the station, they found chaos. The alien security forces were huddled in corners, shaking with fear and unable to move. The Thracians, who normally moved with graceful coordination, were scattered and confused. The Mokari empaths were overwhelmed by the terror they felt from everyone around them. The logical Zelani were frozen in place, unable to process what they were experiencing. But something strange happened when the shadows tried to attack the humans. Mary felt the familiar cold touch of fear creeping into her mind. The whispers started, telling her that she was going to die alone and afraid. The darkness showed her visions of terrible things that would happen to her and everyone she cared about. But instead of freezing up like the aliens, Mary gritted her teeth and kept moving forward. "Stay together and keep moving," Mary called to her team. "Don't listen to the whispers. Focus on your training and remember why we're here." The other Marines followed her lead. They felt the fear just as strongly as the aliens did, but they had learned to work through it. Fear was an old friend to humans, something they had lived with for millions of years. Their ancestors had faced predators in dark forests and survived. They had hunted dangerous animals and explored unknown territories. Fear had always been there, but it had never been allowed to stop them. Dr. Kate Sullivan, who studied how minds worked in stressful situations, watched the human response with fascination. She had come to the station to help with the rescue efforts and was amazed by what she saw. The aliens experienced complete mental breakdown when faced with the Umbral, but humans showed what she called adaptive fear response. They felt afraid, but they could still think and act. "It's like they're processing the fear differently," Kate explained to Pete over the radio. "The aliens are being paralyzed by it, but the humans are using it as fuel. They're more alert, more focused, more determined. The fear is making them better at their jobs, not worse." Mary's team managed to reach the main control center where they found hundreds of alien civilians trapped by the shadows. The creatures had surrounded them but hadn't attacked yet. They seemed to be feeding on the terror, growing stronger from the fear that filled the air. But when the humans arrived, something changed. The Umbral turned their attention to the Marines and tried to break their minds the same way they had broken the aliens. But the humans stood their ground. They raised their weapons and fired at the shadows, even though they weren't sure if conventional weapons would work. The bright flashes of their guns seemed to hurt the creatures, making them pull back and hiss with anger. "They don't like the light," Mary shouted to her team. "Keep firing and stay close to each other." The evacuation took 6 hours. Mary's team and the other human Marines worked steadily through the station, finding groups of terrified aliens and leading them to safety. The Umbral tried to stop them at every turn, but the humans refused to be stopped. They fought through the darkness with stubborn determination, their very presence seeming to push back the shadows. Colonel Ben Parker, who was commanding the human forces, watched the rescue operation with growing understanding. The humans weren't just surviving the Umbral attack. They were actually winning against creatures that had defeated every other species in the galaxy. The difference wasn't in their technology or their training, it was in their nature. "We're not immune to fear," Ben said to Kate as they watched the last group of civilians being evacuated. "But we're not controlled by it either. We've learned to live with it, to use it, to make it work for us instead of against us." The successful evacuation of the trade hub was the first victory against the Umbral in centuries. Word spread quickly through the galaxy that humans had found a way to fight back against the ancient enemy. But Ben knew that one victory wasn't enough. The Umbral were still out there, and they would learn from this defeat. If the galaxy was going to survive, they needed to remember how to fight like their ancestors had fought, with courage, determination, and the willingness to face their fears. Dr. Alex Turner stood before the massive sealed door that led to the deepest vault beneath the Galactic Council building. The door had been locked for 300 years, and according to the records, it was never supposed to be opened again. Behind it lay the War Archives, the collected knowledge of every conflict that had ever happened in the galaxy. The Council had sealed it away when they chose peace over preparation, believing that some knowledge was too dangerous to keep. Colonel Ben Parker had requested access to the vault after the successful evacuation of the trade hub. He believed that the key to defeating the Umbral lay in understanding how they had been beaten before. The Council had argued for days about whether to open the seal. Many of them feared that releasing the old knowledge would bring back the violence they had worked so hard to eliminate from their society. Alex worked with a team of alien scholars to break through the quantum locks that protected the vault. Each lock required a different type of key, and some of them had been designed to destroy the contents if they detected the wrong approach. It took them 2 weeks of careful work to finally open the door. When the vault opened, Alex felt like he was stepping into a tomb. The air inside was stale and cold, and the walls were lined with data crystals that contained more information about war than the modern galaxy had ever imagined. There were records of battles that had lasted for decades, weapons that could destroy entire star systems, and strategies that had been used to defeat enemies that seemed impossible to beat. The team started with the oldest records, from the time when the galaxy was young and every species was still learning how to survive. They found descriptions of wars that made the modern aliens sick to read. Whole populations had been wiped out by biological weapons. Planets had been turned into radioactive wastelands. Species had been driven to extinction by enemies who showed no mercy, but it was the records of the Umbral Wars that truly shocked them. These creatures of living shadow had appeared in the galaxy thousands of years ago, when the various species were still primitive and violent. The Umbral had fed on the fear and chaos of those ancient wars, growing stronger with each battle. They had nearly consumed the entire galaxy before the species learned how to fight back. Commander Rachel Stone, a human strategic analyst, studied the battle plans that had been used against the Umbral. She was amazed by what she found. The species that had defeated the Shadows had not done it through advanced technology or superior numbers. They had won by becoming something that the Umbral feared more than the Umbral were feared by others. They fought monsters by becoming monsters, Rachel explained to the research team. But they did it with purpose and control. They knew exactly when to be brutal and when to show mercy. They understood that sometimes you have to embrace your dark side to protect the things you love. The ancient weapons were completely different from anything the modern galaxy used. Instead of clean energy beams that stunned their targets, the old weapons were designed to kill and to make a statement while doing it. There were blades that could cut through shadow itself, projectile weapons that roared like thunder when they fired, and explosives that could turn night into day. Captain Roy Baker, a human military engineer, examined the weapon designs with growing excitement. "These aren't just tools," he said. "They're psychological weapons. They're designed to send a message to the enemy. We are not afraid of you, and we will hurt you if you threaten us." The records showed that the Umbral were creatures of silence and darkness. They used fear as their primary weapon, feeding on the terror of their victims. But the ancient species had learned to fight back with light and noise and the promise of pain. They had created weapons that were specifically designed to hurt beings made of shadow and whispers. Daleks found records of training programs that taught soldiers how to function in the presence of fear. The ancient warriors had practiced fighting, while terrified, learning to use their fear as a source of strength rather than weakness. They had studied their enemies not just to defeat them, but to understand them well enough to become something even more frightening. The research team worked for months to understand all the information in the vault. They learned about battle strategies that had been forgotten for centuries, weapon designs that could be adapted for modern use, and most importantly, the mindset that was needed to fight an enemy like the Umbral. But the most important discovery came from the final records of the Umbral Wars. The ancient species had not just defeated the Shadows. They had driven them away by becoming something that the Umbral could not understand or control. They had embraced their capacity for violence without losing their humanity, becoming warriors who fought not because they loved war, but because they loved peace enough to defend it. The galaxy's leaders read the reports with growing understanding and fear. To defeat the Umbral, they would need to become something they had spent centuries trying to evolve beyond. They would need to remember how to be dangerous, how to fight, how to kill when necessary. The question was whether they could learn these forgotten skills without losing the civilization they were trying to protect. Master Sergeant Dan Miller watched the ancient foundries of Mars come back to life for the first time in 50 years. The massive machines had been shut down when the galaxy achieved peace, their purpose forgotten in an age where weapons were no longer needed. Now they roared with fire and purpose once again, fed by the urgent need to create tools of war that the modern galaxy had never seen. Don oversees the production of weapons that seemed primitive to the peaceful species but were designed using knowledge that had been locked away for centuries. The forges created blades that could cut through shadow itself, their metal infused with elements that the Umbral could not touch. The factories produced kinetic firearms that fired solid projectiles instead of energy beams, weapons that roared like ancient thunder when they were used. The other species watched the weapon production with mixed feelings of fascination and horror. The Zilani tried to understand the logic behind creating tools designed only to kill, but their purely rational minds struggled with the concept. The Mokari empaths felt sick when they touched the weapons, sensing the violent purpose they were made for. The Thracians found the crude designs disturbing after centuries of creating only beautiful art. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Blake was chosen to lead the first combined force that would test the new weapons against the Umbral. She had volunteers from every major species in the galaxy, beings who had overcome their peaceful nature to learn the art of war. Training them was the hardest thing Sarah had ever done because she was teaching them to do something their entire culture said was wrong. Dr. Tony Chun served as the unit specialist in alien psychology, monitoring how the different species adapted to combat training. The Mokari volunteers struggled the most. their empathic abilities making them feel every bit of pain and fear during practice fights. But gradually they learned to channel their emotional sensitivity into protective instincts, becoming fierce defenders of those they cared about. The Zilani approached warfare like a mathematical problem, calculating the most efficient ways to disable their enemies. Their logical minds actually gave them an advantage once they accepted that violence was sometimes the most rational solution to a problem. The Thracians were the biggest surprise, discovering that their artistic nature could be applied to the flowing movements of combat. The first real test came when the Umbral attacked the mining world of Kepler 442b. The Shadows had taken control of the underground tunnels and were using them as a base to launch attacks on nearby systems. Sarah's combined force was sent to drive them out and reclaim the planet for the galaxy. Captain Bill Rogers led the first assault team into the dark tunnels beneath the planet's surface. The Umbral were waiting for them, confident that they would face the same paralyzed resistance they had encountered everywhere else. But instead they met warriors who understood fear and had learned to use it as fuel for their determination. The humans charged first, their battle cries echoing through the tunnels as they swung their shadow-cutting blades and fired their thunderous weapons. The alien volunteers followed close behind, their own voices joining the war song that had not been heard in the galaxy for 300 years. The sound alone seemed to hurt the umbral creatures who were used to silence and whispers. Bill felt something he had never experienced before as he fought through the tunnels. It was a dark satisfaction, a primal joy that came from successful hunting. His ancestors had felt this same feeling when they brought down dangerous prey or defended their families from predators. The Umbral had expected to face prey, but instead, they found predators who refused to be victims. The battle lasted for 3 days. The combined force fought their way through tunnel after tunnel, driving the Shadows back with light and noise and the promise of violence. The Umbral tried their usual tactics of psychological warfare, but the warriors had been trained to expect fear and to use it as a weapon of their own. The alien volunteers discovered things about themselves that they had never known existed. The peaceful Mokari found that they could be incredibly fierce when protecting others. The logical Zilani learned that sometimes emotion was more effective than pure reason. The artistic Thracians realized that destruction could be as beautiful as creation when it served the right purpose. When the last Umbral was driven from the tunnels, the combined force stood victorious in the deep darkness beneath the planet. But the victory had changed them. The humans who had led the charge carried a new hardness in their eyes, a darkness that came from embracing their violent nature. The aliens had discovered parts of themselves they thought had been evolved away. Centuries ago, the galaxy watched the reports of the victory with awe and fear. Humanity had not just taught the other species how to fight. They had awakened something that had been sleeping in every sentient being. The capacity for violence had never really disappeared. It had just been hidden beneath layers of civilization. And peaceful evolution, the sword had been brought back to a galaxy that had forgotten its edge, and now everyone was learning to wield it once again. Admiral Carl Thompson stood on the bridge of his flagship as the combined fleets of the galaxy approached the shadow realm between stars. 6 months had passed since the first victory on Kepler 442b, and now they were ready for the final battle against the Umbral. His ships carried weapons that would have been considered barbaric just a year ago, but now they were the galaxy's only hope for survival. The Umbral stronghold existed in a place that shouldn't be possible, a region of space where darkness had weight and substance. The Shadow Realm was partially outside normal reality, a pocket dimension where the creatures had hidden for thousands of years. Getting there required ships, equipped with special engines that could punch through the barriers between dimensions. Commander Helen Price led the first wave of boarding parties toward the massive Umbral mothership that floated in the center of the Shadow Realm. The ship was made of living darkness, its hull pulsing like a giant heart. Strange whispers came from it, voices that tried to fill the minds of anyone who came too close with visions of terror and despair. The alien Marines followed Helen into battle, their own warrior instincts fully awakened after months of training and fighting. The Zilani had rediscovered their capacity for protective rage, channeling their logical minds into tactical brilliance. The Mokari had learned to turn their empathy into righteous fury, feeling the pain of every umbral victim and using it to fuel their determination. The Thracians surprised everyone by becoming the most creative fighters in the fleet. They approached battle like an art form, using their shared consciousness to coordinate attacks that were both beautiful and deadly. Their light weapons created patterns in the darkness that confused and hurt the shadow creatures. The final assault began when Admiral Thompson gave the order to fire every weapon at once. The Shadow Realm lit up like a newborn star as thousands of ships unleashed their fury against the umbral stronghold. The creatures screamed in voices that had never known pain before, their whispers of terror replaced by their own cries of fear. Helen's boarding party fought their way through corridors made of living shadow, their weapons cutting paths of light through the darkness. The umbral tried to stop them with visions of horror, but the warriors had learned to transform fear into strength. They moved forward with grim determination, their battle cries echoing through the impossible geometry of the shadow ship. Dr. Larry White documented the final battle from his position on the command ship. He watched as beings who had been peaceful for centuries embraced their capacity for violence in service of a greater good. The galaxy had learned that true peace was not the absence of conflict, but the presence of those willing to stand against the darkness. The climax came when Admiral Thompson faced the last umbral commander in single combat. The shadow being was ancient and powerful, a creature that had fed on fear for thousands of years. It tried to break Thompson's mind with visions of humanity's destruction, showing him every possible way that his species could suffer and die, but Thompson stood firm, his sword gleaming with the light of fusion fire. The weapon had been forged using the ancient knowledge from the war archives, designed specifically to hurt beings made of shadow and whispers. "You made one mistake," Thompson said as he raised his blade. "You thought fear was the strongest force in the universe, but you forgot about something more powerful, the refusal to stay afraid." The Admiral struck the killing blow, and the umbral commander dissolved into wisps of shadow that faded away like smoke. With their leader destroyed, the remaining umbral lost their cohesion and began to retreat to the deepest voids between galaxies. They carried with them the knowledge that the universe had remembered how to fight back. The victory was complete, but it came with a price. The galaxy had been changed by the experience of war. The peaceful species had rediscovered parts of themselves they thought were lost forever. They had learned that the capacity for violence was not something to be ashamed of, but a tool that could be used to protect the things they loved. In the years that followed, the galaxy found a new balance. The weapons of war were not abandoned, but they were kept ready for when they might be needed again. The other species learned from humanity's example, understanding that true strength came not from eliminating their darker impulses, but from controlling and directing them. The humans had taught the galaxy an important lesson, that sometimes the only way to preserve peace was to be prepared for war. They had brought back the sword without losing their humanity, becoming guardians who stood watch against the darkness that lurked in the spaces between stars. The galaxy remembered fear, but it also remembered courage. The shadows had been driven back, and with them went the illusion that civilization meant the absence of strength. The sword had been brought back, and with it came the knowledge that some things were worth fighting for, no matter the cost.